The air in the dusty Spur saloon was thick with the scent of sawdust, spilled whiskey, and the day's lingering heat finally giving way to the cool Arizona evening. A tinny, cheerful tune from an upright piano in the corner barely managed to cut through the low rumble of conversation and sporadic bursts of laughter. Cowboys, their faces grimy with trail dust, leaned against the long mahogany bar, nursing their drinks. At a back table, a trio of prospectors argued in hushed, excited tones over a tattered map. It was a typical Tuesday night in Redemption Gulch, a fragile harmony of tired men seeking a brief escape. Alara moved through it all like a phantom. At 19, she had a quiet efficiency that made her almost invisible, a quality she cherished. She refilled glasses, wiped down sticky tables, and offered a weary but genuine smile when necessary. Her faded calico dress had been mended in a dozen places, and her hands were rough, but she worked with a focused grace, her eyes always cast slightly downward. She was saving every penny, dreaming of a life far from the clatter and coarseness of the saloon. Her employer, Silas Thorne, was a fair man, gruff but not unkind, and that was more than she could have hoped for. The saloon doors swung open with a force that made them slam against the inner walls, silencing the piano mid-chord. Every head turned. Framed in the doorway stood Beatrice Thorne, Silas's wife. She was a stark contrast to the dusty patrons, dressed in a deep purple taffeta gown that rustled with every slight movement. Her hair was coiled perfectly, and a diamond pin at her throat caught the flickering lamplight, casting sharp, cold glints. She never worked in the saloon, but she surveyed it as a queen might survey a troublesome and filthy colony. Her gaze swept over the room with undisguised contempt before landing, like a hawk spotting its prey on Alara. With deliberate, measured steps, Beatrice advanced into the room. The patrons shifted uncomfortably, turning back to their drinks but keeping their ears open. The silence was heavy, broken only by the rustle of her dress. She stopped beside a table Alara had just cleared. She ran a gloved finger across the dark wood, then held it up for inspection, though there was nothing on it. "Is this what my husband pays you for?" Beatrice's voice was not loud, but it was sharp and carried across the now silent room. "To leave filth for our customers to dine in, or are you simply too simple-minded to handle a rag properly?" Alara froze, her heart pounding against her ribs. She could feel dozens of eyes on her. "Ma'am, I just wiped it." "Do not talk back to me, girl," Beatrice snapped, her voice colder now. "You are a servant here. Your job is to clean, not to offer excuses." In a corner, partially obscured by shadow, a young man looked up from his book. It was Samuel, the Thorne's son. His face remained passive, but his eyes, dark and intense, were fixed on the scene, watching his mother's cruel performance unfold. Beatrice's lips curled into a final, dismissive sneer. "See that you learn your place, girl. This establishment may cater to the dregs of this town, but it will not be run by them." With a dramatic swirl of her expensive shawl, she turned on her heel and swept out of the saloon, the swing doors groaning shut behind her, leaving a vacuum of sound and dignity in her wake. The silence she left behind was heavier, more suffocating than the one that had met her arrival. Alara stood frozen, the phantom sting of Beatrice's words painting her cheeks in a hot, shameful flush. She could feel every eye in the room on her, 100 silent judgments pressing down. Her hands, clenched around the damp rag, trembled uncontrollably. All she wanted was to disappear, to melt through the floorboards and away from the pity and morbid curiosity in the patrons' gazes. But there was nowhere to go. This was her job, her prison, until she earned enough to escape it. A low murmur began to ripple through the room as men shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The piano player, a weary old man named Silas, tentatively placed his fingers on the keys, attempting to stitch the torn atmosphere back together with a few hesitant notes. But the melody faltered, thin and fragile. Then another sound cut through the tension, the scrape of a chair against the wooden floor. From the corner where he had been observing, Samuel Thorne rose. He didn't move with the bluster of his father or the arrogance of his mother. Instead, he moved with a quiet, deliberate grace that drew every eye. He didn't head for the exit or the bar, but walked directly toward the table, the scene of the crime. Elara flinched as he approached, bracing for another wave of humiliation, perhaps in order to finally clean the table properly. But he stopped beside her, his presence a shield rather than a threat. He ignored the gawking patrons, his gaze finding hers. For a moment, he just looked at her, his expression holding a flicker of something she couldn't name, apology, perhaps, or anger on her behalf. He then reached into his waistcoat pocket and drew out not a small coin for a drink, but a heavy, gleaming silver dollar. With a quiet clink that echoed like a gunshot in the still room, he placed it firmly in the center of the table his mother had condemned. Leaning in just enough for her and those closest to hear, his voice was low but steady. "For your trouble," he said, his eyes never leaving hers. "The table looks spotless to me." Silas's hands froze over the piano keys. The tentative notes died, plunging the saloon into a profound, shocked silence. The music had stopped. Cold. Every single person was now staring at the saloon owner's son, who stood beside the humiliated barmaid in a quiet, unmistakable act of defiance. The silver dollar was a small, cold sun on the dark wood of the table, and for a moment, it was the center of the universe. Elara couldn't tear her eyes from it. The pianist's hands hovered over the keys, a cord left hanging in the thick, silent air. Every eye in the Dusty Spur saloon was fixed on her and Samuel Thorne, the silence stretching so taut it felt like it might snap and lash them all. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of pure terror mixed with something else, something warm and unfamiliar that spread through her chest. Beatrice would hear of this. Of course she would. This town ran on whispers, and this act was a thunderclap. Her job, her small room upstairs, her fragile foothold in Redemption Gulch, it all felt like it was crumbling. Yet, when she finally dragged her gaze from the coin to Samuel's face, the fear receded slightly. His expression was calm, his eyes steady. He wasn't looking at the crowd, he was looking at her, and in his gaze there was no pity, only a quiet, resolute understanding. The spell was broken not by the music restarting, but by Samuel's voice, low and even, cutting through the tension. "A whiskey," he said, his tone soft enough that only she and the nearest tables could hear. "If you're not too busy, that is." The mundane request was so jarring, so normal, that it shocked her back into motion. "Of course, Mr. Thorne," she managed, her voice a reedy whisper. The formality felt like a shield. She turned on unsteady legs and walked back to the bar, feeling the weight of dozens of stares on her back. Her hands trembled as she reached for a clean glass and the bottle of aged bourbon, the good stuff, reserved for special patrons. This felt like a moment that qualified. The dam of silence burst. A low murmur started near the back and rippled through the room, growing into a hum of hushed conversations. Men leaned over their tables, speaking behind their hands, their eyes darting between the bar, the table with the silver dollar, and the swinging doors his mother had disappeared through. The Thorne family drama, usually a private, cold war, had just become a public spectacle. Elara carried the drink back, her focus narrowed to the amber liquid sloshing in the glass. She placed it carefully on the table, next to the coin. Her fingers brushed his as she pulled her hand away, a brief, electric touch. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod of thanks. Without another word, he took a slow sip, his presence a silent fortress around her. He didn't stay long, just long enough for his message to be branded into the memory of everyone present. He finished the whiskey in 2 more swallows, stood, and walked out, leaving the silver dollar right where it was. Elara was left standing in the center of the saloon, a whirlwind of fear, gratitude, and a dangerous, burgeoning hope. The dust had barely settled on Samuel's silver dollar when word of his defiance reached the Thorne residence. It traveled on the whispers of a stable boy and was delivered with a grim satisfaction by the housekeeper. Beatrice Thorne received the news not with an outburst of rage, but with a chilling stillness. She sat in her parlor, the fine lace of her cuffs perfectly arranged, her teacup resting untouched on its saucer. When Samuel returned home, the air in the house was thick and cold. a stark contrast to the oppressive heat outside. "You made a spectacle of yourself," she began, her voice low and sharp, cutting through the silence. She didn't rise to greet him. "You undermined me. You chose the word of a tavern girl over your own mother in front of the entire town." Samuel stood in the doorway, his hat in his hands. He looked tired, but his resolve hadn't wavered. "I chose the truth, Mother. The table was clean. The girl was innocent. Your quarrel was with me, not with her." Beatrice's eyes narrowed. My quarrel? My quarrel is with the erosion of this family's name, a name you seem determined to drag through the mud. Associating with her, defending her, it makes us look weak. It makes you look foolish." "I think it makes us look human," Samuel countered, his voice steady. "Something the people in this town are beginning to forget about us." He took a step forward. "She did nothing wrong. I will not stand by and watch you use your power to break someone for sport." The silence that followed was a battle of wills. Beatrice finally picked up her teacup, her hand perfectly steady. "You will find," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, "that your protection is not as potent as you believe. And she will learn that the cost of your favor is far higher than she can afford." Meanwhile, back at the dusty spur, Alara moved through the evening in a haze of anxiety. Every pair of eyes felt like an accusation. The whispers followed her as she cleared glasses and wiped tables. Some patrons offered her small, sympathetic smiles, while others watched with a morbid curiosity, as if waiting for the other shoe to drop. Her boss, a weary man named Silas who rented the saloon from the Thorns, simply told her to keep her head down. It wasn't advice, it was a warning. Fear was a cold knot in her stomach, but beneath it, a tiny, unfamiliar ember of hope flickered. The memory of Samuel's quiet stand. A silver dollar shining like a promise on a clean wooden table. The chill of Beatrice's threat lingered in the air long after she was gone, and its tendrils quickly found their way to Alara. The next day at the dusty spur was a quiet kind of torture. Silas, the saloon manager who usually treated her with gruff fairness, suddenly couldn't find a single thing she did right. He assigned her the grimiest tasks, scrubbing the spittoons, hauling heavy crates from the cellar, all while watching her with a nervous, hawk-like intensity. The other barmaids, who had previously offered sympathetic glances, now kept their distance, their eyes darting away whenever she caught their gaze. They were afraid, and Alara knew the source of that fear was Beatrice Thorne's long shadow. Worse than the cold shoulders were the whispers. They coiled around the saloon like smoke, indistinct but suffocating. She caught snippets as she delivered drinks, thought she was better than her station, and playing the victim to catch a rich man's eye. Each word was a small, sharp stone thrown from the shadows. The narrative had been twisted. She was no longer the wronged party, but a conniving upstart. Her humiliation had been weaponized against her, and the weight of the town's judgment felt heavier than any crate from the cellar. Samuel saw it all. He had come into the saloon late in the afternoon, not as a patron, but as an observer. He watched from the doorway as Silas berated Alara for a spill that wasn't her fault, saw the venomous looks from the town's more self-righteous gossips. He knew his mother's work when he saw it. It was never a direct assault, but a slow, suffocating squeeze designed to isolate and break a person. His silver dollar had been a statement, but it wasn't a shield. It was time for more. He waited until her shift ended, long after the sun had dipped below the dusty horizon, painting the sky in bruised shades of orange and purple. He found her in the alley behind the saloon, her shoulders slumped in exhaustion as she leaned against the rough-hewn wall. She flinched when he approached, her hand instinctively going to the worn handle of the small knife she kept tucked in her apron for protection. "I'm not going to hurt you, Alara," Samuel said, his voice low and steady. He kept a respectful distance. "I came to warn you and to apologize." She lowered her hand, her eyes weary but wary. "Apologize for what? For being decent? For being naive?" he corrected. "I thought a public gesture would be enough. I underestimated my mother's cruelty. What she's doing to you, the rumors, Silas, that's her way. She won't stop until she's made you an example." Alara wrapped her arms around herself, a futile defense against the cold and the fear. So what am I supposed to do? Just quit. Let her win? No, Samuel said, taking a step closer. The alley was dark, but the faint lamplight from the street caught the earnestness in his eyes. We don't let her win. I have some money saved. Enough for you to leave Redemption Gulch, start somewhere new where the Thorn name means nothing. Or you can let me help you fight back. But you need to know, it will get worse before it gets better. He offered her not just a choice, but a partnership. The alley was no longer just an exit, it was a crossroads. The cold night air in the alley was sharp, a stark contrast to the stale warmth of the saloon. Samuel's offer hung between them, heavy with the weight of two possible futures. One was a dusty road leading away from Redemption Gulch, a lonely path to an unknown life, but a life free from Beatrice Thorn. The other was a fight, right here, on ground that felt increasingly hostile. Elara wrapped her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders, her gaze fixed on the hard-packed dirt at her feet. To run was the sensible thing to do. She had a little money saved, and with Samuel's help, she could be in the next county by sunrise. No more whispers, no more glares from Sela's, no more fear every time the saloon doors swung open. But the thought left a bitter taste in her mouth. She had come to this town with nothing and had carved out a small, respectable existence for herself. The dusty spur was just a job, but her life here was hers. To let Beatrice chase her away felt like admitting she was the worthless creature her accuser claimed she was. She looked up, meeting Samuel's steady gaze. In the faint moonlight, she saw not pity, but respect. He wasn't trying to save a damsel. He was offering an alliance to an equal. That small, unspoken acknowledgement was all the strength she needed. "I'm not running," she said, her voice quiet but firm, losing its earlier tremor. "This is my home, I won't be bullied out of it." A slow smile touched Samuel's lips. "I was hoping you'd say that, but we can't fight her head-on. She controls my father and through him, this town. It would be her word against yours." "So what do we do?" Elara asked, her fear now replaced by a cold, focused resolve. "My mother's power is built on fear," Samuel explained, his voice dropping lower. "She has hurt many people in this town, not just you. They're all too scared to speak up alone. But together," he let the idea settle, "we don't need to shout, we just need to find the cracks in her foundation." He thought for a moment. "I remember Martha, the laundress. My mother ruined her business over a supposedly torn shirt 5 years ago, drove her right out of her shop. She works from her home now, barely scraping by. She hates my mother, but she's terrified of her." "You think she'd help us?" Elara asked. "I think she'd listen," Samuel corrected. "It's a start." Meanwhile, inside the saloon, Silas the manager approached a table where Beatrice sat, having returned to discreetly observe the fallout. "He talked to her in the alley," Silas reported, keeping his eyes down. "The Thorn boy, they were out there a long time." Beatrice's fingers tightened around her teacup. She didn't know what they'd said, but she knew what a private conversation in an alley meant. It wasn't a gesture anymore. It was a plan. A cold fury settled over her. Her son had made his choice. Now she would make hers. The air in Martha's laundry was thick with the scent of lye soap and steam. She twisted a worn cloth in her hands, her eyes darting nervously between Elara and Samuel. "Speak against Mrs. Thorn," she whispered. "That's not just losing business, Mr. Thorn. It's asking for ruin." Elara met the older woman's gaze, her own fear a familiar ache. "I know what it feels like to be afraid of her," she said softly. "But if we don't stand together, we fall alone." Before Martha could answer, the door swung open with a crash. Sheriff Cooper stood framed in the doorway, his face grim. Behind him, the saloon manager, Silas, wrung his hands. "Elara," the sheriff's voice boomed, silencing the hiss of the pressing irons. "Beatrice Thorn has reported a theft, a large sum of money from the saloon's safe." Silas, avoiding her eyes, pointed a trembling finger. "I saw her, lingering by the office after closing." The lie was so blatant it stole Elara's breath. But Samuel stepped forward, his body a shield between her and the accusers. "That's impossible, Sheriff. I was with her." Just then, Beatrice herself appeared, gliding to the front of the small crowd that had begun to gather. She fixed the sheriff with an icy stare. My manager's word against my son's misguided gallantry. Arrest the girl. The confrontation spilled onto the dusty Main Street. For Alara, the humiliation was a sickening echo of that first night, but this time she was not alone. Samuel stood firm beside her, his voice ringing out across the tense silence. This isn't about theft. This is about cruelty. How many of you have stayed silent while my mother used her name to bully you? A nervous murmur rippled through the onlookers, but no one spoke. Beatrice smiled, triumphant. But then, a new voice cut through the air, shaky but clear. He's right. All heads turned to Martha, who had stepped out of her shop, her fear eclipsed by a hardened resolve. Last year, she accused my son of stealing a locket until he was forced to leave town. I found it in her laundry a month later. She just told me to be quiet about it. A gasp went through the crowd. The blacksmith suddenly spoke up, recalling a debt falsely claimed. The baker's wife followed, recounting how Beatrice had tried to ruin her shop over a perceived slight. The dam of fear had broken. Story after story cascaded out, washing away the foundation of Beatrice's power. Her face went from confident fury to ashen shock. The town was no longer looking at Alara, they were looking at her. Sheriff Cooper cleared his throat, sensing the monumental shift. He glanced at a sweating Silas, then back at the exposed Beatrice. Seems there's been a misunderstanding, he grumbled, before tipping his hat to Alara and melting back into the crowd. Defeated, Beatrice stood alone for a moment before turning and walking away, her retreat stripped of all dignity. A week later, the dusty Spur Saloon felt lighter. The music was warmer, the laughter genuine. Alara moved with a newfound confidence, not just a barmaid but a respected figure. Samuel, having used his inheritance to buy a partnership from his distant father, worked beside her. As the last patron left, he looked over at her, the lantern light catching the steady strength in her eyes. Redemption Gulch, he said with a small smile, finally living up to its name. She smiled back, a promise of a new beginning hanging in the quiet, peaceful air.